What if XG went Electroclash? This week we'll be celebrating the Japanese-born, Korean-trained global pop phenomenon, whose retro-futuristic sound and image have made them one of the most consistently fascinating acts in the modern pop mainstream. And we'll also be taking a little look at the Electroclash genre, the edgy movement that emerged from the underground clubs of Europe and made old-school electronica the cool new sound of the early 2000s. All that and more on this week's What If, How and Why. Hi, my name is Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel, and then on Wednesdays follow it with one of these companion videos where I discuss the artists and genres involved in the What If video and also share a little bit of my creative process. The idea of the What If videos is that each week I pick a popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to go out completely different from the version we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was X-Gene by XG, and I tried to reimagine that as an Electroclash song. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. Now, as with most contemporary pop stuff, being a bit old and out of touch, I was pretty slow to catch on to XG. I think the first time I heard of them at all was towards the end of last year, just because a news story about them broke containment of K-pop adjacent places on the internet and leaked over into the more mainstream media. And that was when Kokona, the group's youngest member, came out as transmasculine non-binary, which is a pretty big deal in pop music in general, and especially in K-pop adjacent circles where you're operating in an industry that's very much built on a highly specific, idealized version of femininity and female beauty. So it sent some shockwaves through that kind of community, I think, and I just remember thinking it was really cool. Thought, I'll have to check that out. Promptly completely forgot all about it, and it never crossed my mind again for several months. I only ended up revisiting them in a really roundabout way, because I'd been gradually, very belatedly again, getting into the hip-hop artist Rhapsody, who'd been making great records for years and years and years, but I'd never really properly investigated until this year. Just listening to a bunch of her stuff, which includes a bunch of great collaborations with people like Jizza and Kendrick Lamar. And one of the collaborations that I came across ambling my way through a back catalogue was a collaboration with someone called Durin Asaya. I have no idea who that is, but fair enough, clicked on it, watched this video, and it's fantastic. This great US rapper going bar for bar with this young Japanese woman who is really kind of holding her ground, and I thought, oh, that's awesome. And of course it turned out that this Durin Asaya is the leader of XG. So then I thought, okay, I really do have to actually check these out, and started just diving into their back catalogue and was just immediately super impressed. There's plenty more stuff that shows off their aptitude in a hip-hop style, but what I was really impressed with was just the sheer range of other stuff that they were capable of doing as well. So I delved through the back catalogue and found out a little bit more about them. It turns out I've been missing out for a good few years, because they actually debuted, I think, back in 2022. But then, as I found when I watched the documentary that helpfully is there on YouTube, charting their early years, their roots go back way before that, because they were training for a good 5 years before they actually were ever shown to the public. They've got a pretty interesting story, I think. The brainchild of this guy who goes by Simon Jacobs, although I don't think Simon was necessarily his given name. He was born in the States, but is of mixed Japanese and Korean heritage. And the Jacobs bit is actually a composite name that he created for his production persona, which stands for Japan and Korea produced by Simon, apparently, which is a bit convoluted, but there you go. He'd had his own career as a Korean pop idol, and then decided to move into the songwriting and production side of things. And obviously somewhere along the line has come up with this idea of creating his own group that combines his Japanese heritage with the K-pop system and also his own love of Western pop music that he grew up with. So I think like the roots of XG go back to auditions that were held in Japan, from which you picked a group of kids who were then selected for an intensive training camp in Korea. And if you watch the documentary on YouTube, you see this process of this lengthy 5-year pull from all these kids being selected initially to it being whittled down to the final group. The whole thing's obviously put together by Simon, so there's a certain amount of it that does feel like blatant self-promo, although he doesn't actually come out of it tremendously well for me, and I suspect probably for quite a lot of Western viewers, because it's a pretty brutal, unforgiving process to put such young kids through. And although he can be kind to them, and he obviously gives them a bunch of useful guidance, he can also be extremely unkind at various points as well. There are sequences with kids literally being made to repeat dance moves until they can't physically stand. You know, it's just, some of it just seems needlessly cruel. But on the other hand, by the time the final group emerges at the end of it, they're ridiculously well drilled. I can't deny that the group he's put together is phenomenal. It loosely divided into a rap line and a vocal line. There's 3 members who are mainly focused on singing, 4 members who are mainly focused on rapping, but everyone's very good at everything. All incredible dancers as well. I think from the moment they debuted, you can kind of tell that they're a very serious proposition. There's no sort of sign of rookie awkwardness about them. They come out like they're ready to kill anyone who stands in their way. First 2 singles for me are a little bit weaker. Tippy Toes, the debut, it's pretty cool, but it's a little bit one note, slightly underwhelming once you've heard some of their later stuff. And Mascara, the second single, again for me, it feels a bit disjointed. It's got a phenomenal pre-chorus, and then the rest of the song doesn't quite match up to it. But after that, the third single was Shooting Star, which when I finally heard that, it's just to me one of the best pop singles I've heard in the last 20 years, and pretty much everything since then has been gold as far as I'm concerned. And one of the things that I particularly like about them is that a lot of their music is based on references that I'm very familiar with, because it's really delving into loads of stuff from the late 90s and early 2000s, both kind of classic hip-hop. There's loads of stuff that just references the kind of hip-hop that I was listening to in my late teens, early 20s. Loads of that era of R&B as well, hints of TLC and Destiny's Child and Aaliyah, and then other things that you wouldn't particularly expect to hear from a Japanese group, particularly like UK garage, bits of that kind of pop up here and there, house music, and even on their most recent record, which is actually their debut full-length album, The Core, there's one track that dips into Avril Lavigne meets Sum 41 style chart pop punk, which was like a bit of a bolt from the blue, but very amusing. So what they do is very cunningly put together in that it appeals to people of my generation and probably a few years younger and a few years older, because we recognise all the stuff that it's referencing. So you get this warm glow of nostalgia, but at the same time, it still feels really fresh. They find ways of putting a twist on stuff to make it their own, to make it contemporary. I've said a couple of times already that they're a K-pop adjacent group. As I say, they're all Japanese. They were all living in Japan, and that's where the group was formed, but it was forged in the K-pop system. But unlike most K-pop and pretty much all J-pop, they sing exclusively in English. I think Simon really decided from day one that the focus was going to be on global marketing rather than marketing specifically to the Japanese or the Korean audience, which has led to a bit of an interesting situation where in their native Japan, although they are undoubtedly popular, I mean, they've filled the Tokyo Dome before now. Apparently, from things that I've read from fans in Japan, they don't really get an awful lot of media exposure in Japan. They're not particularly in the general public eye over there. I think because the Japanese music industry tends to be quite insular in a way. Artists tend to sing mainly in Japanese and tend to focus largely on the domestic market. And those who have a more brazenly outward-looking approach can get a bit sort of shunned by the Japanese music industry. I think the same thing happened earlier with baby metal and with One OK Rock as well to a certain extent. So it's a pretty bold move really to form a group that's coming out of Japan, have them perform in a second or third language and take on Western pop at its own game. But frankly, they're succeeding. So they've developed this army of alphas across the world. There was quite a lot of worry in that fan community earlier this year, because whatever I think of Simon, he undoubtedly did mastermind the group and had a hand in pretty much everything that they've done. But yeah, earlier this year, him and a bunch of other top executives at Xgalax, which is their company, were arrested for, I don't know if it was just cocaine use or cocaine possession, and probably kind of removed from their position in the company, which, as a Westerner, it's mad to think of cocaine use being a thing that gets you in trouble in the music industry, because if people in Western music industries' careers were ended for using cocaine, then the entire industry would die overnight. But yeah, so all of a sudden, a little bit earlier this year, after closely guiding every aspect of the group's career, he's just gone. So I think there was a lot of concern as to how they were going to continue, but I mean, current signs seem really positive. They're currently on a world tour, which has been getting rave reviews, seems to be going really well. And they just, a little over a week ago, by the time this video comes out, performed at Fuji Rock Festival, which I think was a pretty big deal for what's essentially an idol group, being a festival that's definitely more focused on rock and indie and alternative kind of acts. There were definitely people worried that they weren't going to fit in, that they weren't going to go down very well, but I've just seen so many rave reviews of it. So many people going off their head, having seen XG for the first time at this festival and then becoming fans overnight. So hopefully the future is still looking bright, even without this guy who's been their mentor from day one. I guess there hasn't been any new music since the change in management and production, and it remains to be seen what direction they're going to take. There's a lot of discussion about that going on online, which is actually kind of what prompted me to want to do this video this week, because I saw a bunch of alphas discussing, what do you think XG's next direction is going to be? Could they have a go at hyperpop? And a bunch of people going, yeah, that'd be good. So I joined in the discussion, just saying, they could do hyperpop, and they do it really well. But one of the things that I liked most about them was that rather than doing whatever the current trend is, they were really good at picking up on genres from the past that maybe people have forgotten a little bit and refreshing them and making them new. So I'd be more excited to see XG doing, and reeled off a few genres, one of which is Electroclash. And from that moment, I've been thinking about what an Electroclash XG song would sound like. So eventually I had to try and actually make it happen. Now, I've said in past videos where I've been attempting various types of electronic dance music and things that I've never been a particular fan of dance music. I don't have a particularly deep connection with electronic music, but Electroclash is actually one of the genres that I did kind of enjoy when it had its spell of mainstream attention back in the early 2000s. I think there were a few things that made it appeal to me a bit more than a lot of the other electronic music that was around at the time. Partly, as with the appeal of XG, it was the fact that it just reminded me of a bunch of older music that I already liked. So although it was kind of operating in the contemporary dance music field, it had a real throwback feel to loads of cool stuff that I did definitely enjoy, like Kraftwerk, like Depeche Mode and a bunch of other early electropop, electro-punk stuff as well, things like Suicide and the Screamers you could hear bits of, even early industrial, Cabaret Voltaire or Nitzereb in some of these things, so that was definitely part of the appeal. Also, certainly a lot of the stuff that made it onto the radio felt like it was a bit more in a conventional kind of song structure format than a bunch of dance music, which is more reliant on just setting up a groove and running with it. There were discernible verses and choruses, and it felt a bit more like listening to a pop song. So it was kind of the perfect electronic genre for someone who was a punk or an indie kid or whatever to get into. And at the time I was listening to a bunch of stuff like La Tigre and also Kathleen Hanna's first solo album, Julie Ruin, which were operating on a lo-fi electronic punk level, and Electroclash felt pretty adjacent to that, especially groups like Chicks on Speed, who were doing a very pointedly feminist version of the Electroclash sound. I guess I only really started paying attention to Electroclash when it started to have a little bit of a mainstream breakthrough, when things started to creep over onto Radio 1. Early singles by Peaches and Fisher Spooner started getting some airplay, but I gather it had actually been fermenting away in the underground clubs of Europe for quite a few years. There's a Munich-based DJ called DJ Hell who had a label called International DJ Jiggle Records, which I gather was instrumental in releasing some of the earliest Electroclash records, notably those by Miss Kitten and the Hacker, who made 1982 and Frank Sinatra, which are both cracking records, kind of established this sound that was raw and dark, but also had quite a sense of deadpan humour about it. So those records gather a bit of momentum, make their way through the underground, and gradually you start to see other artists in other parts of the world picking up on that sound and creating their own versions of it, blending these old school drum machine and synth sounds with this sense of punky rawness and nihilism. Subject matter that's occasionally pretty dark, occasionally even pretty kinky, but also, as I say, with a bit of a wicked sense of black humour about it too, and quite often accompanied with some fairly wild and provocative stage shows. I mean, Peaches particularly is legendary for adding basically a whole kind of performance art side to her stage shows to accompany the music. So it's pretty exciting stuff. And then Radio 1 picks up on it, the mainstream music press kind of picks up on it, and a few records break through into that mainstream space, emerge by Fisher Spooner, things like that. And for a little while, Electroclash was absolutely the new big thing, and you see a bunch of sort of mainstream pop artists start incorporating bits of this into their sound, with like Kylie Minogue and even Holly Valance releasing singles that to all intents and purposes sound like Electroclash records. But as with all these things, its time in the mainstream was never going to particularly last. The mainstream artists who were interested in that just assimilated the bits they wanted from it into their sound and moved on to the next thing. Whereas I think most of the actual Electroclash artists weren't particularly interested in being mainstream pop stars anyway, and were quite happy to just carry on ploughing their own furrow, being as idiosyncratic as they liked without having to worry about commercial considerations so much. So that music's continued to exist, just a bit out of the spotlight, and a bunch of those early pioneers are still doing great stuff. I know Peaches is still touring and still putting on spectacular shows. And yeah, Electroclash may not have been the kind of second coming that some of the more hysterical elements of the music press tried to paint it as back in the early 2000s, but it did create a bunch of really interesting fun pop records with a really cool retro-futuristic kind of aesthetic, and probably also pointed a bunch of young people at the time back in the direction of a bunch of that great music that inspired it, which is, reason enough for it to exist in itself. Anyway, that takes me up to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in my alternate timeline this week, it's 2023 in an alternative universe. XG have released their first few singles and they've been doing really well. They're just gearing up to get ready to record their debut EP, the New DNA EP, when unfortunately scandal breaks at X-Galax and Simon and a bunch of other executives are promptly removed from the company. So basically like what happened in our timeline, but a couple of years earlier. So the remainder of the company and the group are a bit stunned by this and are wondering how they're going to respond. They've been relying on Simon for their creative direction all this time. Who can they possibly find who will be able to continue to develop the group's trademark mix of cool late 90s, early 2000s throwback sounds with cutting-edge otherworldly futurism? So they cast around looking for ideas and somehow eventually land on Caroline Hervé, otherwise known as Miss Kitten, the Electroclash pioneer. So they bring her in and she chats to the group and is immediately inspired by their extraterrestrial lore that they have, and bearing that in mind, crafts this new sound for them that blends elements of old school synth punk and electropop and industrial with their futuristic sci-fi mythology to create a dark, exciting new sound for XG, and inspires a full-scale Electroclash revival in the process. So, in attempting to turn XG into an Electroclash song, the first step as ever was to get the original vocal, drop it into GarageBand and sync it up to the grid. Now, XG in its original form isn't a full-length song. It's paired with an instrumental called Hesano, which between them make up this sort of 2-minute introduction to the record. So I knew I was going to have to chop it around a bit to turn it into more of a full-length song. But I didn't want too much vocal because I wanted to keep things fairly minimal. So it was kind of the perfect choice, really. So all I did was cut out Jorin's line of XG, yeah, we're born with the X gene, and then just repeated that over 4 times to create a chorus with the last bit of the last line pitch shifted down an octave just to make it sound a little bit otherworldly. So I created kind of a pretend chorus from that. So instead of just being a rap section, then a singing section, and then the track's over, we've got a chorus, then a rap section, then another chorus, then another rap section, then the singing section, then an out chorus, So I managed to take this 1.5 minute long song up to nearly 3 minutes. The next thing was programming some drums. I wanted a good old school kind of 80s sounding drum machine, so found one that seemed pretty suitable. Fed it through some overdrive just to give it a bit of saturation, a bit of grit. Programmed a pretty simple beat, fairly basic kick and snare stuff, just some slight degree more interested in the hi-hat patterns just to shake things up, and then going into more of a kind of 4 on the floor thing in the last chorus just to give it a bit of extra momentum towards the end. I added a second drum machine for some different sounds. I wanted to add some fills and some claps and a few other details, and the second one I've got has got some much more bombastic tom sounds, which I made even more bombastic by adding like massive cavernous reverb to it, so that adds a sense of drama when those claps and those toms come in as well. And next thing after that was some bass. So synth bass, we're keeping everything pretty synthesized, so picked a couple of different sounds. I've got one that's just a kind of 8th note pulse, does nothing fancy, it just bubbles away there on the root notes. And to give that a bit more grit, I've got a guitar fuzz pedal that I kick on in the louder sections just to give it a bit of extra oomph, and then toggle off when we get to the quieter bit, like the singing section. That runs through the verses, and then in the chorus I've got a separate bass sound which just has a sort of arpeggiated alternating octave, which just gives things a little bit more movement and makes that chorus a little bit more exciting. Didn't want things to sound too slick, so I didn't want to fill the track out with pads, but I did want some kind of ambience in there, so I found a couple of soundscapey effects, which I've just got panned hard left and right. There's one called Ghostly Reversed Organ, which I've used on a couple of things, which is great, just kind of quite unpredictable sound that just kind of fades in and out. That's on one side, and I've got, I can't remember what the other one's called on the other side, but a similar thing with slightly unpredictable dynamics that just sort of floats in and out of your hearing. And I wanted to add a couple of different lead riffs in different places, so just found some cool analog synth sounds. I wanted proper old school, like late 70s, early 80s kind of sounds, playing pretty minimal, spiky, repeating patterns that crop up in different places. And then the only things on there that aren't synthesizers are a couple of electric piano tracks. So I've got one that is mostly just playing a single bass note and then moves up a couple of octaves to play some higher notes during the quiet section. I fed that through a distortion pedal, a tape echo, and I think a flanger to give it this rhythmic pulse with a fair amount of grit and quite a lot of movement and modulation in the sound as well. And then the other electric piano comes in during the build-up section before that final chorus, just playing 3 notes just repeated, but just building in intensity. I automated a massive increase of distortion and echo, so it starts off fairly clean and then just becomes this echoing, distorted mess before that last chorus. Didn't add too much else, just tried to keep it fairly minimal sounding and just gradually building things up, so by the end you've got quite a lot of layers on, everything's a bit more big and booming and saturated, and I think it came out okay in the end. And then for the video, as ever, started out by just trying to find some good performance footage of the track. Found a couple of really good fan cams from very close to the stage. Different performances, but both in the same tour. I meant to credit the person whose fan cams I used and I've forgotten their name, I'm so sorry. But I took these 2 fan cams. The performances are really tight, so it's exactly the same performance, just with some slight differences in costume and from slightly different angles. So use that as my main basis, and then just to try and get some authentic Electroclash elements in there, I've got some performance footage of Miss Kitten DJing, so I thought, well, you know, we'll have her operating the decks and on the console there, and also the hacker, her erstwhile musical partner, playing the keyboards as well. So we've got those 2 providing some extra authentic backing. So because I'd artificially extended the song, I've had to cut the performance footage up quite a bit, including the bits from Hesino, the introduction section 2, to make it a full length. And for the artificial chorus that I created, I used just a tiny clip from another performance, which has a bit more of a close-up on Durin's face. It's from, I think, an official channel, so I put filters on it to try and prevent it from getting copyright blocked. So we just have that kind of repeating round on that chorus bit as well, whenever that section crops up. So I hope you enjoyed this. I've had Electroclash on my list of genres to try try and do for a little while. And I've just been really enjoying XG's music recently, so it was a fun thing to put those two things together, and I thought the sort of retro-futurist element of the group and the style went pretty well together. So hopefully I won't have offended any alphas by doing this. If you did enjoy it, let me know what you think down in the comments, and if you could like, share, subscribe, all that stuff really helps. I'd greatly appreciate it. If there's anything else you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any artists or songs or genres you'd like me to investigate, do let me know. Your suggestions are always welcome. Otherwise, that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I will hope to see you next time.